World War II rings with the echoes of many rifle volleys directed against blindfolded rebel patriots standing stolidly against a stone wall or tied hurriedly to a convenient telegraph pole. The foreign conqueror, however, is usually vulnerable in his attenuated lines of communication. The franc-tireur is an elusive opponent. The spirit of free men thrives on oppression. In the European theatre, the French Maquis has become a valiant and symbolic figure in his untiring struggle against the Nazis. Equally impressive in the Pacific is the rise of the Filipino against the Japanese invader. The Filipino guerrillas fought for the same principles as the European underground, against the same background of peril, ruthlessness, and hardship. After abortive efforts to draw the people of the Philippines into the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere by propaganda, quislings, bribery, and subversion, the Japanese were forced to resort to wholesale arrests, punitive expeditions, and summary executions in an attempt to stem a steadily rising tide of opposition. Repressive measures, however, only increased the determination of the Filipino patriot to resist. The 7,000-odd islands of the Philippines, sprawling along 1,000 miles of ocean, made it impossible for the Japanese armies to garrison more than key towns in the populated and cultivated districts. The sparsely settled farmlands and the virtually inaccessible mountains of the interior were left relatively unoccupied by enemy troops. Since the Philippine constabulary had been demobilized with the invasion, the mass of people in the outlying areas was left without adequate police protection. Such a situation soon encouraged the rise of numerous marauding parties that roamed the countryside in search of easy loot and tribute to be taken from defenseless farmers. As usual in such cases, the harassed people took matters into their own hands, the small vigilante groups that were. Organized by the oppressed population, were soon transformed into the more militant guerrilla forces that were to prove so valuable in the campaigns of 1944 and 1945. By mid-1942, the guerrilla movement had developed to such an extent that it became possible to establish more or less organized units, which later grew into major divisions of American and Philippine forces. The period of formation for guerrilla units and the development of their operational capabilities was difficult. Most of the early formations had to overcome the problem of inadequate arms and ammunition. Some groups conducted long and arduous journeys to bring back food and equipment. In many areas, the early fighters were forced to survive through their own resources and with the support of their home community. As they fought against the Japanese, they won the respect and allegiance of their neighbors, and as the war continued, they began to receive recognition as a legitimate fighting force. The creation of the guerrilla organization was gradual, and the first successes were quite limited. Some of the early Filipino guerrillas were composed of former constabulary and military officers who had been driven into the hills to escape the Japanese. They established contact with other officers, returning soldiers, and individuals. Each group maintained its own operational unit and carried out isolated raids and ambushes on enemy troops or supply lines. Many of these groups gradually merged into larger units, while still retaining local autonomy. In 1942, the guerrilla movement came under the overall direction of the American command, and substantial amounts of supplies and equipment began to flow to them. The initial organization was established under the command of Colonel James A. Cushing. Units in the field became consolidated into 4 major guerrilla groups, the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th, which were to have a great impact on the military effort of American and Philippine forces in the post-liberation campaign. The guerrillas not only mounted their own operations against the enemy, but also furnished intelligence to the American military. They reported on enemy movements, locations of supply depots, and troop concentrations. The information they provided became invaluable in assisting the American forces during the liberation campaign in 1944 and 1945. As the campaigns proceeded, many guerrilla units became effective fighting forces. They demonstrated their effectiveness during the battles for Luzon in early 1945. The guerrillas in the Cagayan Valley provided a constant flow of valuable information to the American forces that fought in the region. Their intelligence efforts resulted in the discovery of enemy positions, supply lines, and routes of retreat. Their activities disrupted Japanese operations and forced the enemy to deploy their forces ineffectively. When the American forces returned to the Philippines in 1944, the guerrillas were ready to assist. They provided operational bases, supply points, and support to the American troops as they moved forward. The cooperation between American forces and guerrilla units resulted in a more rapid advance against Japanese resistance. The success of the guerrilla movement in the Philippines was not without its sacrifices. Many guerrilla fighters were killed or captured by the Japanese, while others endured extreme hardships. Their efforts, however, played a vital role in the liberation of the Philippines and the defeat of Japanese forces in the region. On the contrary, it is their bounden duty and responsibility to inspire our people to willingly undergo any kind of difficulties and sacrifices for the sake of noble principles that they nourish deep in their hearts. America is at war with Japan not because she wants to keep the Philippines, but to uphold and maintain the principles of democracy therein. In the speeches of Japanese military authorities, especially that of General Homma, formerly Commander-in-Chief of the Japanese Imperial Force in the Philippines, they condemned democracy and the principles of liberty under such a system of government. It is therefore evidently fallacious and insincere on your part to state that you are not pro-Japanese nor pro-American, but pro-Filipino. What do you mean by being pro-Filipino? What are the principles for which you stand as a pro-Filipino? What national objectives do you have in mind when you express the thought that you are pro-Filipino and not pro-Japanese nor pro-American? What ideals do you propose to realize as a pro-Filipino? If you have any objectives and ideals at all, do you believe in realizing them more effectively under a totalitarian and absolute system of government than under a democracy? You are decidedly wrong when you told me that there is no ignominy in surrender. That may be true in the case of soldiers who were corralled by the enemy, consisting of a superior force with no way of escape whatsoever. For when they gave themselves up, they did not repudiate any principles of good government and the philosophy of life that inspired them to fight heroically and valiantly, to use your own words. Should I surrender, however, and with me the people, by your own invitation and assurance of guarantee to my life, my family, and those who follow me, I would be surrendering something more precious than life itself. The principles of democracy and the justice of the honor and destiny of our people. I noted you emphasized in your letter only peace and the tranquility of our people. You and your fellow puppets are trying to give them peace and tranquility by destroying their honor and dignity without suffering or, if there is any, the least possible. On the other hand, we endeavor to inspire them to face difficulties and undergo any sacrifice to uphold the noble principles of popular rule and constitutional government, thereby holding up high and immaculate their honor and dignity at the same time. In other words, you are trying to drive our people to peace and tranquility on the road of ignominy, to borrow your own language. Peace and tranquility are easy to achieve if you choose the easy way. But in that case, you would be living beneath the dignity of a human being. You would be reducing our people as a result thereof to the status of a dumb animal like the good carabao, which lies in the peace and tranquility you are talking about. Would this not be clearly ignominious? You may have read, I am sure, the story of Lincoln, who held firmly to the conviction that the secession of the southern states from the North was wrong. If Lincoln had revised his convictions and sacrificed them for the sake of peace and tranquility as you did, a fatal catastrophe would have befallen the people of America. With this lesson of history clearly before us, I prefer to follow Lincoln's example than yours and your fellow puppets. I hope I have made myself clear enough to make you understand my position. I will not surrender as long as I can stand on my feet. The people may suffer now, and may suffer more during the next months. To use the words of St. Paul, the Apostle, "The sufferings of the present are not worthy to be compared with the glory to come that shall be revealed in us." Confessor's feelings were echoed in the hearts of the majority of his countrymen. Their struggle was bitter and sometimes marked by internal discord and petty bickering, but the Filipino guerrillas managed to keep the torch of freedom burning during the period from the fall of Corregidor to the liberation of Luzon. During the course of the war, every island produced its local forces to resist the enemy. Although the size and geography of the Philippines made it difficult for the Japanese to interfere with the continued growth of the numerous small guerrilla bands that had sprung up on the various islands, this very topography was a tremendous handicap to any effective unification of strength. Isolated from each other and from the outside world, the guerrillas at first dissipated their efforts in uncoordinated raids against the enemy. These minor operations were generally fruitless and often did more harm than good, since they brought swift and severe retaliatory measures by the Japanese. Even on the larger islands of Luzon, Mindanao, and Leyte, the terrain and poor communications caused a multiplicity of initially independent guerrilla commands to arise with intransigent leaders pursuing their own particular interests. A single driving force was badly needed to direct the guerrilla potential into channels that could produce maximum results. As soon as the facts concerning Filipino resistance became known in 1942, it was General MacArthur's purpose to provide this direction and to weld the scattered groups into unified and responsible forces through the designation and support of responsible local commanders. The story of guerrilla activities in the Southwest Pacific Campaign can be divided into 3 phases. Phase 1, consisting of the initial exploration of the guerrilla movement by the Allied Intelligence Bureau under the operational control of G2. Phase 2, comprising its development under the Philippine Regional Section, and Phase 3, composed of the merging of all guerrilla activities with the actual invasion of the Philippine Islands. The fall of Corregidor in May 1942 cut off virtually all communication with the Philippines. A single radio station operated in the Luzon province of Nueva Ecija by a Philippine Army officer, Lieutenant Colonel Guillermo Z. Nakar, and several other Filipino and American escapees, continued to provide a slender thread of information for several months. Messages from this station broke off in August 1942. However, and with the subsequent capture and execution of Colonel Nakar by the Japanese, radio contact with the Philippines was temporarily lost. In October 1942, 2 unsurrendered officers, Captain William L. Osborne and Captain Damon J. Goss, who had made a hazardous journey from Luzon in a remarkable feat of navigation, arrived in Australia with the first reports of guerrilla activities on southern Luzon, Palawan, and Tawi-Tawi. In December, other escaped personnel brought in more detailed information concerning numerous guerrilla groups in operation on central Luzon, Leyte, Samar, Cebu, Negros, and Panay. During this same period, radio contact was re-established, and intercepted calls from guerrilla commanders on northern Luzon and Panay added to the picture. By the beginning of 1943, it was clear that organizations to combat the Japanese were forming everywhere in the islands, and that with proper exploitation, valuable intelligence could be obtained locally for use in planning future operations. Steps to penetrate the Philippines by clandestine methods began in earnest. At this early stage, General MacArthur was obviously limited in the amount of aid he could give the guerrilla organizations to help them through their embryonic stages. His own supplies were inadequate, and the great distances involved made the problem of tangible assistance formidable. The initial task of contacting the guerrillas and laying the groundwork for an extensive intelligence net in the Philippines was given to the Allied Intelligence Bureau under the operational control of the Theatre G2. A long-range program was developed based on previous experience with AIB operations behind enemy lines in the Solomons New Guinea area. In October 1942, the AIB established a special Philippine subsection for the exclusive handling of operations to assist the guerrillas. Solutions were worked out for the best methods of dispatching supplies and funds to the Philippines. Areas of responsibility were defined, and plans were made for communication channels to forward information to Australia. The dispatch of a pioneering party to explore the prevailing situation in the islands and develop specific information on the military, political, and economic aspects of the Japanese-dominated Philippine government, as well as on the attitudes of the guerrillas themselves, became a priority project. On the 27th of December 1942, a Filipino aviator, Captain, later Major, Jesus A. Villamore, together with a party of 5, left Australia on the submarine Gudgeon to organise an intelligence net, determine means of receiving emergency supplies, and obtain general information on Japanese activities. The party landed successfully on Negros, and on the 27th of January, just 1 month after his departure, Major Villamore established efficient radio contact with Australia. Meanwhile, 2 agents sent by Colonel Wendell W. Fertig, an unsurrendered American officer who had become a guerrilla leader on southern Mindanao, reached Australia by sailboat. Their reports indicated that this large and strategically placed island could be made into a major guerrilla base for further expansion to the north. Commander Charles Parsons, USNR, because of his wide and intimate knowledge of the Philippines, was selected to lead a secret fact-finding mission to Mindanao and carry in cipher materials and token supplies. This party arrived in Zamboanga, the westernmost province of Mindanao, on the 5th of March. After contacting Colonel Fertig, Commander Parsons presented General MacArthur's concept of guerrilla activities and then went on to visit other islands in the archipelago. Following these 2 initial penetrations, additional parties were sent in as rapidly as strained transportation facilities permitted. Submarines carried supplies to Panay in April and to Tawi-Tawi and Mindanao in May. A number of concealed radio transmission stations were established in these islands, and material support was given to the local guerrillas. This initial exploratory period also saw an outstanding episode of clandestine operations. On the 6th of June 1943, Major Emigdio Cruz, Pennsylvania, arrived in Australia from Washington on the first leg of a secret mission to Manila on instruction from Manuel Quezon, President of the Philippine government in exile. After conferring with General MacArthur and members of his staff, Major Cruz sailed aboard the submarine Thresher and landed on Negros on the 9th of July. From there, he ingeniously worked his way across the intervening islands to Luzon, posing at various stages along the way as an itinerant trader, a vendor of fowl, and a vegetable peddler. Several times he narrowly missed discovery by the Japanese, but despite frequent arrests and searching interrogations, he finally arrived safely in Manila on the 22nd of October. Major Cruz's main mission in Manila was to contact General Manuel Roxas, a well-known Filipino politician with intimate knowledge of high-level Japanese activities in the Philippine puppet government, who was in constant communication with the various guerrilla leaders on the islands. After a series of conferences with General Roxas and personal contacts with the other government officials, Major Cruz had accumulated sufficient important data on the inner workings of the Philippine puppet regime to dictate his return to Australia. On the 8th of November, he left Luzon for Negros, and by the end of February 1944, he had retraced his difficult course to complete a brilliant and extremely hazardous mission. Besides the highly important intelligence brought back, Major Cruz's journey showed that, despite the great risks involved, the occupied islands of the Philippines could be traversed by a person with sufficient daring, judgment, and ability. The information collected by these few penetration parties provided a good working basis for future plans. The guerrilla units could be classified into 3 main categories. 1. Nucleus of unsurrendered troops, those built around a nucleus of unsurrendered United States and Philippine Army troops. 2. Local origin units, those of purely local origin, under the leadership of prominent civic personages or former constabulary, which sprang up more or less spontaneously to combat the immediate threat of uncontrolled banditry. 3. Pre-war organizations, those like the Hukbalahaps, which were an outgrowth of pre-war semi-political organizations. There were also a few roving bands of the outlaw variety, motivated more by the lucrative prospects of brigandage under cover of guerrilla warfare than by any consideration of patriotism. Although the majority of the guerrillas shared a common antipathy for the Japanese, they were often divided among themselves, separated into intractable rival factions engaged in a bitter struggle for power. There was no established demarcation of authority and no defined chain of command. All reports of returning ALB agents stressed the necessity of achieving greater cooperation and more unified control among the guerrilla organizations. It was considered that the best way to meet this problem would be to reactivate the pre-war Philippine military districts. Based on population densities, These territorial entities had been used by the Philippine Army for administrative and mobilization purposes. This device had the advantage of being based on legal precedent and would probably be the most acceptable method of division to the majority of de facto guerrilla leaders. In accordance with this concept, the 1st District commanders were appointed in February 1943. Colonel Fertig was given command of the 10th Military District on Mindanao, and Lieutenant Colonel Macario Peralta was appointed to the 6th Military District on Panay. Since these officers already exercised considerable influence over adjacent islands, Colonel Fertig was also assigned responsibility for the 9th Military District, embracing Leyte and Samar until a permanent commander could be selected. Colonel Peralta was similarly given temporary control over the 7th and 8th districts of Negros and Cebu. Meanwhile, the development of the Philippine communications net progressed steadily. Navy and Signal Corps departments cooperated closely with the Philippine subsection of ALB in working out a coordinated program to meet immediate needs and provide for future expansion. Separate networks were mapped out for guerrillas and AIB parties, with additional provisions for a special naval coast-watching system to cover important strategic waterways. June 1943 marked the end of the preliminary phase of SWPA's penetration into the Philippines, the exploration of the guerrilla potential. This initial period had seen effective liaison established with guerrilla groups on Mindanao, Negros, and Panay. Agents in Manila had also been contacted. In cooperation with the U.S. Navy, supplies and trained personnel had been transported by submarine to Tawi-Tawi, Mindanao, Cebu, and Panay, and put in the hands of the local leaders. The groundwork for a widespread intelligence net had been begun under Major Villamor, with heartening results. Steps had been initiated to expand the procurement of supplies, weapons, and capable personnel, and to increase the number of intelligence parties sent into the islands. Radio stations had been established and developed until the operation of an efficient, comprehensive communications system was well on its way. A good and encouraging start had been made. The second phase of guerrilla development in the Philippines began in June 1943 with the activities of the Philippine Regional Section. This new section, formed from the original Philippine subsection of ALB and given semi-autonomous status, was organized in late May under Colonel Courtney Whitney to handle the increasing problems inherent in the rapid development of events and the growing availability of supply facilities. The assistance and coordination of guerrilla operations continued on an enlarged scale, and efforts were intensified to push on from the bases established on Mindanao and Panay into the islands to the north. Additional parties were prepared for the Visayas, and plans were laid for the penetration of Luzon via Mindoro and Samar. To aid this program, facilities for the transportation of supplies under the general direction of Commander Parsons were augmented by the acquisition of more cargo-carrying submarines from the U.S. Navy. To guide the various guerrilla leaders in the prosecution of their operations and to make maximum use of their services in the war against Japan, General MacArthur directed that his agents follow a policy of general encouragement and careful instruction without direct command interference, which might incur resentment. Guerrilla groups were advised to assist in maintaining civil order so that they might receive reciprocal popular support. They were also cautioned to refrain from open and aggressive warfare against Japanese troops, lest they bring reprisals on the people out of all proportion to the results achieved. The collection, coordination, and transmission of useful intelligence were stressed as the most important immediate contributions the guerrillas could make to the Allied cause until the actual invasion of the islands was begun. Before that time, all military operations were to be limited to strategic harassment, sabotage, and ambush. On Panay, despite strong personal differences, Tomas Confesa's civil government worked with Colonel Peralta's guerrilla organization to collect voluntary contributions and taxes to support the resistance movement. On Mindanao, the civil government and the guerrilla forces under Colonel Fertig were closely affiliated. With the authorization of President Quezon, the guerrillas issued their own currency and even carried on their own postal system. A planned agricultural production and distribution program was also mapped out to ensure a maximum food supply. Such measures were indicative of Japanese weakness in the Philippines and of the Filipinos' potential for independence. During the latter half of 1943, the Philippine Regional Section sent 2 new parties to pierce the line north of the Central Visayas. In October, Major L.H. Phillips led a group of agents to the island of Mindoro, just south of Luzon. Major Phillips was able to establish a radio station and develop some contacts in Manila. Unfortunately, the encouraging start made on Mindoro was short-lived. In February 1944, just 3 months after Major Phillips's arrival, the Japanese managed to discover his hideout in Mount Calavite, and, after a futile attempt to escape, Major Phillips was killed and his headquarters destroyed. In July 1944, Commodore George F. Rowe, USNR, succeeded Major Phillips as GHQ representative and was able to re-weld the severed radio link between Mindoro and Australia. A party sent to Samar in November 1943 under Major Charles M. Smith was more successful in its efforts. Major Smith set up a radio control station that was in contact with GHQ by December 20th and established a firm base of operations for further advances. From his position on Samar, he dispatched a number of his men to Masbate, Cebu, and to south and central Luzon. The planting of agents in these various localities was to bring forth valuable intelligence information to aid in planning Philippine invasion operations. By the end of 1943, a communications net had been established covering most of the southern Philippines. This net formed a framework for later development and extension into the areas to the north during 1944. Meanwhile, Commander Parsons had returned to Australia in the late summer of 1943 from his fruitful mission to Mindanao and its neighbouring islands. After the information he carried back had been coordinated with the plans and activities of the Philippine Regional Section, Commander Parsons set out a second time in October to expand the contacts made on his previous trip. He again remained on Mindanao for several months, helping Colonel Fertig to consolidate his control and to increase the efficiency and value of his organization. In February 1944, Commander Parsons conducted still another supply run to Mindanao, Tawi-Tawi, and Mindoro. His name became well known throughout the southern islands of the Philippines, and his lifeline supply service was famous among the important guerrilla leaders. The first half of 1944 saw a marked speed-up in the activities of the Philippine Regional Section. The number of submarine-borne parties was increased, and the tonnage of transported materials considerably augmented. In January, supplies were landed on Panay and Negros, in February on Tawi-Tawi and Mindanao. The month of May was particularly active. A large party of specially trained agents was dispatched to Colonel Smith on Samar and another to Colonel Fertig on Mindanao. Additional quantities of supplies were brought into this latter island for distribution to the north. During May, too, the first agents were sent to the island of Palawan. In June, a party with complete equipment for transmission of weather information was sent to Negros. By the middle of 1944, as plans for the invasion of the Philippines were fast ripening, the scope of the Philippine Regional Section's expansion in the archipelago had reached the point where direct participation by the various staff sections of General MacArthur's headquarters became desirable. The vital early steps of arranging contacts, ascertaining actual conditions and the problems facing the guerrilla movement, sending in supplies and equipment, establishing an intelligence net, and organizing military commands within the areas of guerrilla activity had been largely completed. Guerrilla activities had to be thoroughly coordinated with operational plans of the Southwest Pacific area for the coming assault. In June, therefore, the functions of the Philippine Regional Section were decentralized, and the further direction of the guerrilla movement was apportioned among the general staff sections so that the optimum result in each phase of activity could best be achieved. A nucleus of the Philippine Regional Section continued as a coordinating and advisory agency, with all operations between SWPA and the Philippine guerrillas now channeled directly into the invasion planning of specific GHQ staff sections. The third phase of development was opened. During this stage, the guerrillas emerged from their hideouts to take their places in battle beside the advancing American divisions. Because of its large size, rugged terrain, and location farthest from the center of Japanese occupation in the Philippines, Mindanao was particularly adaptable to the easy formation of guerrilla groups. Japanese troops held only a few main cities along its 400-mile coastline and paid little attention to the interior of the island. It enjoyed comparative freedom from Japanese surveillance and pressure, and was consequently the scene of early development of guerrilla organizations. The growth of the guerrilla movement on Mindanao was in general prototypic of the movements in the rest of the Philippine Islands. On Mindanao, however, the movement matured earlier and with less hostile interference. With the complete absence of Japanese inland patrols, small guerrilla bands quickly made their appearance throughout the interior. The many mountains, limited road networks, and primitive communication facilities at first kept these groups isolated from each other, and a certain mistrust and jealousy on the part of the guerrilla leaders prevented any initial attempts at consolidation. In addition, the vast expanse of the island, with almost 3 weeks required to journey from east to west, increased the obstacles in the way of operational coordination. As time passed, however, the bond of common purpose and the advantages apparent in unification induced the various leaders to seek some means of cooperation. The smaller groups soon blended into larger ones, and finally Colonel Fertig emerged as the generally accepted commander of the Mindanao guerrillas. Colonel Fertig and the guerrilla movement in the Philippines. Colonel Fertig was a former American mining engineer who had fought on Bataan, and then, upon its surrender, escaped to Mindanao to serve with General Sharp. When Mindanao, in turn, fell to the Japanese, Colonel Fertig took a group of officers and men into the hills to form the nucleus of a responsible resistance movement. Through perseverance and diplomacy, Colonel Fertig gradually won the respect of the other guerrilla leaders, and by October 1942 he had built up a fairly cohesive guerrilla organization. In November, Colonel Fertig decided that the time was ripe to notify General Headquarters of the potentialities of his organization and to request assistance. He dispatched his 2 emissaries, Captain J. A. Hamner and Captain Smith, on their trip to Australia, which resulted in the subsequent contact by Commander Parsons. With authority over the 10th Military District, as conferred by GHQ at the time of Commander Parsons' first trip, and with the approval of the Philippine government in exile, Colonel Fertig attempted to establish a smoothly functioning civil government to parallel his military organization. Former Philippine officials were appointed as provincial governors and to other civic posts. By early 1943, conditions on Mindanao had become so stable that President Quezon authorized the creation of the Mindanao Emergency Currency Board to issue its own monetary notes for use as a medium of exchange among guerrilla forces. Before the swift-moving events of the war made it advisable for General MacArthur to make his first strike in the Philippines directly at Leyte, it had been planned to retake the islands by an initial invasion of Mindanao. This fact, together with a convenient geographical position that eased the problem of transportation by submarine, constituted the main reason why the Mindanao guerrillas were the first to be supplied extensively. It was a sound strategical investment. With the assistance of SWPA, the Mindanao guerrilla organization eventually became the largest and best equipped in the Philippine Islands. By January 1945, Colonel Fertig's command included a force of about 38,000 men. His radio and intelligence network consisted of some 70 transmitter stations and an excellent and extensive coastwatcher system. GHQ was furnished with a constant stream of information which, within its limits of accuracy, helped considerably in the planning of operations against the Japanese in the Philippines. The guerrillas had also prepared airfields at Dipolog, Labo, Lala, and Barobo. When General MacArthur was ready to retake the Philippine Islands, the guerrillas on Mindanao were in a position to contribute substantially to military operations. With the American invasion of the southern Philippines in early 1945, they began to strike openly against the Japanese forces occupying the island. They seized the airfield at Dipolog, held it until elements of the 21st Infantry landed, and later helped them defend it against strong Japanese counterattacks, while a squadron of American fighters used the field as a base for operations to the south. When the American forces chased the Japanese from Zamboanga City, guerrillas set up strong positions behind the retreating enemy troops to form a wall against any further escape into the mountains. On the 12th of April, 5 days before the first 8th Army landings along Illana Bay on Mindanao's west coast, Colonel Fertig notified General Eichelberger that the initial objective of Malabang and its airfield had already been captured by the guerrillas. Acting on this information, the American forces made their assault further down the coast at Parang for a drive on the enemy-held town of Cotabato. On the 10th of May, when elements of the U.S. 40th Division landed near Bugo on northern Mindanao's Makajalar Bay, they found that the guerrillas had cleared the Japanese from the beaches and were ready to assist in the advance to the important town of Cagayan. Aiding the drive of the U.S. 24th Division, Colonel Fertig's forces guarded Highway No. 1 from Cabacan to the Tangkulan River so that the Americans could race across the island without fear of an unguarded flank. Guerrilla troops also seized the Tagum River area on North Davao Gulf, as well as Talikub Island in the Gulf itself. Slightly to the northwest of Mindanao lie the three islands of Negros, Cebu, and Bohol. The growth of guerrilla organizations on these three islands followed a pattern very similar to that of Mindanao. After the usual birth pains of interfaction rivalries and petty jealousies, the islands gradually evolved their own de facto commands, which eventually were unified under a few main leaders. Unlike Mindanao, where the guerrilla movement developed primarily under the leadership of American officers, these commands were mainly Filipino-organized and Filipino-led. On Negros, the chief character to arise as commander of the central and northern portions of the island was Captain Salvador Abside, Pennsylvania. Captain Abside was originally sent to Negros in November 1942 by Colonel Peralta of Panay. His initial efforts to spread Peralta's control throughout the entire island met with considerable opposition from other guerrilla chiefs, particularly from Lieutenant Colonel Gabriel Gaydor, Pennsylvania, in southern Negros. Major Villamore's dramatic arrival in January 1943 as the forward representative of General Headquarters marked the first genuine progress toward real unification of the Negros guerrillas. His presence as an advisor accredited by SWPA was welcomed by the majority of the guerrilla leaders, and, after his appointment as temporary commander of the 7th Military District in May, a general accord was worked out among the various dissident groups. Major Villamore organized the 7th Military District headquarters, appointed a civil administrator, Henry Roy Bell, and secured authority for the establishment of a free civil government under Alfredo Montelibano, pre-war governor of Negros Occidental. Upon his return to Australia in October 1943, Major Villamore nominated Captain Absede as the man best qualified to assume permanent command of the 7th Military District. When this nomination was finally approved and made official in March 1944, Captain Absede worked aggressively to improve the efficiency of his command. The remainder of the guerrilla units, including Colonel Gaydor's group in southern Negros, was absorbed into his organization, and an amicable relationship was achieved with the free civil government. Captain Absede gave particular attention to the development of his intelligence network and succeeded in providing wide coverage of enemy activities. By December 1944, the strength of Colonel Absede's organization on Negros numbered approximately 13,000 men. East of Negros is the long, narrow island of Cebu, the most densely populated of all the Philippine islands. The story of the guerrilla movement on Cebu is primarily that of two men, Harry Fenton and Lieutenant Colonel James H. Cushing, both American-born. With the Japanese capture of Cebu City in the central part of the island, a large number of U.S. AFI forces escaped to the hills, taking along a sizable quantity of arms and supplies. Numerous guerrilla units were soon formed in the enemy-unoccupied regions to the north and south, and these gradually combined into larger groups. By the middle of 1942, the guerrilla organization on Cebu was split into two bodies, one under Fenton in the north and the other under Colonel Cushing in the south. Despite marked differences in personalities and methods of operation, these two leaders quickly recognized the advisability of uniting their resources for coordinated action against the Japanese. A joint command was established, which put administration under Fenton and combat activities under Colonel Cushing. A single staff served for both factions, and areas of control were delegated to subordinate leaders. This arrangement functioned satisfactorily until mid-1943, when critical food shortages and rapidly dwindling supplies, coupled with intensive countermeasures by the Japanese, seriously disrupted the Cebu guerrilla organization. To aggravate the situation, both leaders fell seriously ill, and all activities were temporarily curtailed. During this period, dormant animosities between the two factions were again aroused. Disagreements arose between Fenton and his associates. Instituting a reign of terror and persecution, Fenton engaged in a series of reckless and injudicious actions that alienated many of his officers. On the 15th of September, he was tried and executed, and his command was reorganized. Colonel Cushing, meanwhile, recovered his health and, in the face of persistent Japanese anti-guerrilla campaigns, began to rebuild his weakened groups for further operations. In January 1944, he was designated by GHQ as commander of the 8th Military District, and shortly afterward, his organization was sent supplies and radio equipment from Australia. Colonel Cushing broadened and improved intelligence coverage on Cebu, and his guerrillas throughout the island worked with increased efficiency. By April, GHQ was receiving a gratifying volume of information on Japanese movements and military operations. On Bohol, the oval-shaped coral island bordering Cebu on the southeast, several guerrilla groups developed, with Major Ismael Ingeniero emerging as the leader of the specially created Bohol Area Command. Internal friction among the guerrilla groups had, to a degree, alienated the civil populace, and when the Japanese landed in force on the island in June 1944, the guerrilla organizations collapsed. Following the Japanese partial withdrawal in July, Major Ingeniero's organization was largely re-established, but little useful information was extracted from Bohol before the major invasion of the Philippines. Despite deficiencies in the resistance organizations on the islands of Negros, Cebu, and Bohol, the guerrilla forces played a significant part in the liberation of their territories when the 8th Army invaded the southwest Visayas. Colonel Absede's units on Negros had done valuable preliminary work to assist the invasion troops. The guerrillas on Cebu had not only maintained contact with the Americans, but had also helped by destroying Japanese positions and installations during the landings. While only a handful of guerrillas participated in the actual assault on Bohol, Major Ingeniero had successfully rebuilt his organization into an effective force, which continued to operate against the Japanese for several months after the fighting had stopped. In September 1944, the two principal guerrilla groups agreed to accept Colonel Smith as their coordinator. In early October, GHQ appointed Colonel Smith as commander of the Samar area. Colonel Smith was in the process of reorganizing the Samar units when the American forces landed on the island. General MacArthur's invasion of Leyte on the 20th of October 1944 sounded the signal for the Philippine guerrillas to throw off the cloak of concealment and come forth in open warfare against the Japanese. Shortly before the assault forces were due to sail for their objective, General MacArthur issued the following alert to the Visayan guerrilla commanders. The campaign of reoccupation has commenced. Although your zone is not at present within the immediate zone of operations, it is desired that your forces be committed to limited offensive action with the specific mission of harassing the movement of the enemy within your area, and, as far as possible, containing him in his present positions. Intelligence coverage must be intensified in order that I be fully and promptly advised of all major changes in enemy disposition. It was on Leyte that the Filipino guerrilla and the American soldier first joined forces in battle. With the initial 6th Army landings on the beaches at Tacloban and Dulag, Colonel Canglion's units went into action. They dynamited key bridges to block Japanese displacement toward the target area. They harassed enemy patrols, and they sabotaged supply and ammunition depots. Information on enemy troop movements and dispositions sent from guerrilla outposts to Colonel Canglion's headquarters was dispatched immediately to the 6th Army. The guerrillas also performed valuable service in maintaining public order and in keeping the roads and highways free of congestion. After the American beachheads were established, the Leyte guerrilla groups were attached directly to the 6th Army Corps and divisions to assist in scouting, intelligence, and combat operations. On neighbouring Samar, a regiment of the 1st Cavalry Division, which landed on the 23rd of October, was aided extensively in its mission by the guerrilla units on the island. The main objective of seizing and controlling the strategic Taft-Wright Highway was achieved by a dual drive of cavalry and guerrilla forces. While the 8th Cavalry battled to capture Wright at the western terminus of the highway, the guerrillas fought the Japanese from Taft on the east. A junction of the two forces in December cleared the enemy from the heart of Samar and prevented his reinforcement of Leyte from the northeast. In contrast to the rest of the Philippine Islands, which were generally lightly garrisoned, the main island of Luzon was heavily occupied by Japanese military forces. Thorough policing and frequent, intensive clean-up campaigns prevented any effective unification of the numerous guerrilla groups that sprang into existence after the surrender of the U.S. AFE units. One of the earliest organizations developed on Luzon was headed by Colonel Claude Thorpe, who, in January 1942, worked his way from Bataan through the Japanese lines to establish a headquarters in the Zambales Mountains. From this retreat, Colonel Thorpe attempted to centralize operations in various regions of the island, including northern Luzon and the Bicol Peninsula. Though he made substantial progress in this direction, his efforts were brought to an untimely end. In October 1942, Colonel Thorpe and several of his staff were trapped in a Japanese raid and subsequently executed. After Colonel Thorpe's death, a multiplicity of independent guerrilla commands began to develop throughout the provinces of Luzon. In the southern half of the island, 3 units were particularly outstanding in their growth and operations. These were the forces of Major Bernard L. Anderson in the eastern region, Major Robert Lapham in the central region, and the marking guerrillas in the sector east of Manila. Major Anderson was contacted by SWPA agents in mid-1944 and in September began to receive supplies and radio equipment brought in by the ever-busy submarines. Major Anderson's efforts to achieve coordination for intelligence purposes were enormously complicated by the concurrent existence of so many independently active organizations in the area to be covered. In addition to the marking guerrillas and the forces of Major Lapham, there were the Hukbalahaps in Pampanga, the East Central Luzon Guerrilla Area, ECLGA units of Colonel Edwin P. Ramsey in East Central Luzon, the Hunters in Cavite, the Phil-American Irregular Troops in Rizal, and President Quezon's own guerrillas in Batangas. These units varied in quality and effectiveness. Making the best of a difficult situation, Major Anderson succeeded in forwarding much valuable information from Luzon directly to SWPA headquarters in Australia. He also distributed some of the supplies he received, especially radio equipment, to other units in southern Luzon to increase the efficiency of the intelligence and propaganda network. The guerrilla situation in the northern half of Luzon remained generally obscure until well into 1944. Distance, difficulty of communications, and the extensive countermeasures of the Japanese hampered any effective SWPA penetration of the upper provinces, either for liaison or supply. After Colonel Nakar's execution by the Japanese and the subsequent loss of contact between his headquarters and Australia, a series of successors attempted to carry on his work in the northern mountains and in the Cagayan Valley. The Japanese in these areas were particularly watchful, however, and as each new leader arose, he was tracked down and eliminated. In a heroic and desperate effort to continue the movement, Colonel Nakar's intrepid lieutenants, Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Noble, Lieutenant Colonel Martin Moses, Major Ralph B. Prager, and Lieutenant Colonel Manuel P. Enriquez, were killed or captured by the enemy before the close of 1943. In early 1944, the command of the main guerrilla forces in northern Luzon ultimately fell to Major Russell W. Volkmann, an unsurrendered American officer. Major Volkmann designated his organization as the United States Army Forces in the Philippines, North Luzon, USAFIP NL, and set about the task of revising the whole guerrilla movement in his area to weld all groups into a single force responsible to a central authority. He divided his command into sectors, giving each sector commander full power to consolidate and control the fragmentary outfits in his particular area. At the same time, Major Volkmann built up a strong intelligence system to funnel all information on Japanese movements in northern Luzon to his headquarters. Major Volkmann's forces grew rapidly, and by the end of 1944 numbered some 10,000 men. The greatest drawback to the full realization of his efforts was the lack of radio contact with General Headquarters, SWPA. Finally, in September 1944, he succeeded in putting a makeshift radio into operation, and through this lone channel of communication, messages began to be sent and received. It was then that the guerrillas in northern Luzon first learned of General MacArthur's imminent return to the Philippines. Agents and equipment sent from Australia in November and December helped coordinate Colonel Volkmann's operations with the American invasion plans. When General MacArthur landed at Lingayen Gulf, the Japanese were caught in the midst of a general redeployment of their forces throughout Luzon. Seizing the advantages of the moment, the guerrillas broke out in full force. Roads were torn up, bridges destroyed, mountain passes blocked, and rail and motor facilities sabotaged at every turn to seriously interfere with Japanese troop and supply movements. Shortly after the American landings, Colonel Anderson was requested to form a Filipino battalion to be attached to General Kruger's 6th Army forces. Colonel Anderson responded by taking the best personnel at his disposal to form the 1st Anderson Battalion. This unit performed efficiently and valiantly throughout central and eastern Luzon, building a battle record of 3,000 Japanese killed and 1,000 captured. Major Lapham's guerrillas in central Luzon played a prominent part in effecting the dramatic rescue of over 500 Allied internees from the ill-famed Cabanatuan prison camp. This daring raid was carried out 25 miles behind Japanese lines by a mixed force of 286 guerrillas, 12 troops of the 6th Ranger Infantry, and 13 Alamo Scouts. The guerrillas acted as the eyes of the raiding force to guide it through the brush and as its ears to be on alert for any surprise flanking movement by the enemy. They constructed roadblocks at the northeast and southwest approaches to the stockade to hold up hostile reinforcements, and also arranged for food caches so that the liberated prisoners could be fed at convenient points along the return route. The attack was launched on the night of the 30th of January 1945. Within 30 minutes, the entire Japanese garrison had been wiped out and the last prisoner removed from the prison area. The Rangers' return was covered by a guerrilla delaying action that successfully fought off approximately 800 enemy reinforcements sent to assault the strategically placed roadblocks. Meanwhile, the litter patients from the camp were transported by a guerrilla-organized Carabao cart train to Sibyl Springs, whence they were evacuated to a hospital at Guimba. On the 23rd of February, in another equally brilliant and even more extensive liberation of Allied internees, Luzon guerrillas helped troops of the 11th Airborne Division to release more than 2,100 prisoners from the Los Baños prison camp in Laguna Province on the shores of Laguna de Bay. For several nights prior to the attack, guerrilla units infiltrated through the Japanese lines to gather in the area of Los Baños. On the morning of the 23rd, one element of the 11th Airborne crossed Laguna de Bay in amphibious craft, while another element took off by plane for a spectacular parachute drop. All forces converged in a swift and coordinated attack that caught the Japanese guarding the camp in the middle of their morning calisthenics. The entire garrison was annihilated with practically no loss to the Allies, and the Los Baños prisoners were evacuated across the bay. The marking guerrillas, led by Colonel Marcos V. Agustin, carried out extensive combat operations in the mountains northeast of Manila. After a month of hard training and fighting with the troops of the U.S. 43rd Division, Colonel Agustin's force, numbering some 3,000 men, was assigned a part in the powerful assault on Ep.8 Dam, the largest of the 3 dams supplying Manila. While 2 prongs of the 43rd Division converged on the dam from the south and west, the guerrilla force formed a 3rd prong that came down from the northwest. The Japanese were routed from their defensive positions, and the dam was captured intact. After successfully completing their assignment in the IPO sector, the marking guerrillas pursued the fleeing remnants of the enemy into the hills, and later aided considerably in other missions, which, in the words of the 43rd Division Commander, Major General Leonard F. Wing, otherwise would have required costly and protracted action by American forces. In the northern half of Luzon, Colonel Volkmann's units fought effectively with One Corps against General Yamashita's beleaguered forces in the high mountains around Kiangan and in the plains of the Cagayan Valley. Supported by planes of the 5th Air Force, these guerrillas were able to clear the enemy entirely from Ilocos Norte province. Operations on Luzon then became the responsibility of the 8th Army, which was engaged in clearing the Japanese from the southern and central Philippines. All drives instituted during the period of I Corps control continued unabated after 14th Corps took over. The 6th Division pushed on against stubborn enemy resistance along Highway No. 4 and reached the town of Kiangan on the 12th of July. Several guerrilla units were held in the northwest until the middle of July to reduce Japanese fortified positions in the Mankayan area. Other Filipino forces moved northeast from Cervantes to seize Sabangan and Bontoc by the 10th of July. From Bontoc, these same forces pressed south along Highway No. 4 toward Banaue, a town that was finally taken by the 6th Division on the 20th of July. 3 days later, contact was established between the American and Filipino units, thus splitting the Kiangan pocket into 2 sectors. Numerous enemy strongpoints continued to maintain a determined defence in mountain positions west of Highway No. 4 until August, but the Japanese forces in the eastern half of the Kiangan sector were again bisected when Philippine guerrillas struck from the northeast, seized Mayoyao, and met elements of the 6th Division moving east from Banaue. Concurrently with the operations of the 6th Division, the 32nd Division, after relieving the 33rd Division in the Tabio area, drove north along Highway No. 11. Philippine Army units pushed south along the same road from Sabangan, and these 2 advancing forces met on the 29th of July, cutting the enemy's last north-south line of communication in the Kiangan sector. The same forces then pressed eastward from the highway to secure the upper Agno River Valley. A battalion of the 32nd Division departed from Daklan, which had been captured by the 33rd Division late in June, and pressed northward along the same valley. At Bugias, on the 8th of August, contact was established with Filipino troops that had moved down the valley from the north. With the valley thus secured, a firm foothold was obtained on the western slopes of the mountains defended by the enemy. It was only a matter of time before the 3-pronged drive formed by the 6th Division from the east, the 32nd Division from the south and west, and the Filipino forces from the north and west would accomplish the destruction of the last organized remnants of General Yamashita's troops. To the north and east of the Kiangan pocket, combat activity during July and August consisted mainly of patrols into the Sierra Madre Mountains, east of the Cagayan Valley. The enemy, by this time, was concerned more with problems of physical survival than with the continuation of the battle. The critical condition of his troops was much in evidence. In the Sierra Madre Mountains, the 37th Division found many Japanese dead from starvation. Farther south, the 38th Division and Philippine guerrillas eliminated the isolated and weakened troops of the once formidable Shimbu defense sector east of Manila. By August, all enemy defenses, except for those in the Kiangan sector, were broken, disorganized, and largely ineffective. Lack of food, widespread malnutrition, and prolonged hardships in the field had rendered General Yamashita's remaining troops capable of little more than nuisance efforts. To these scattered survivors was given a Hobson's choice of surrender or eventual starvation. In the wake of military conquest by foreign invaders, there have developed great and powerful resistance movements from within subjugated peoples. These rebellions against imposed authority have usually brought swift and ruthless suppression. For their own protection, invading armies have branded the patriot, franc-tireur, and guerrilla as a bandit and a criminal in an effort to alienate him from his people and crush his efforts to gain liberation for his country. Fighters of the underground have usually received payment in the form of a one-way ticket to the gallows or the firing squad, very often by way of the torture chamber. They captured San Fernando on the eastern shore of Lingayen Gulf and took part in the drives on Baguio and the succeeding operational bases used by the Japanese in their retreat into the northern hills. Guerrilla destruction of the bridges on the Bagabag-Bontoc Road reduced the Japanese to a single Carabao trail for the transport of supplies. Cervantes, on the way to Basang Pass, was taken by guerrillas, and in a hard-fought battle they captured the pass itself to break into a part of the Japanese defence perimeter. In the bitter fight for Baleta Pass in the Caraballo Mountains, guerrilla infiltration of enemy lines paved the way for the final assaults on this key approach to the Cagayan Valley. In the valley itself, Colonel Volkmann's forces seized the important town of Tuguegarao and occupied its adjoining airfield. So widespread and effective had been the assistance rendered by the Filipino guerrillas in the liberation of their country that General Kruger, upon withdrawing the Sixth Army from combat on Luzon, acknowledged, "The gallant Filipino farmers, despite tremendous difficulties and with very limited means at their disposal, rendered invaluable support to our operations. Their accomplishments are worthy of high praise." By the first half of July 1945, when the Eighth Army assumed combat responsibility for Luzon, the Japanese had been driven deep into the mountains, their main power broken and their destruction or surrender inevitable. A large part of the painstaking task of mopping up these dismembered but dangerous forces was performed by the various guerrilla groups whose elusive fighting tactics were particularly well suited for jungle and mountain warfare against isolated enemy troops. The enormous volume of valuable military information sent by the various guerrilla units in the Philippines to General Headquarters constituted a contribution fully as important as their direct combat participation. The extent and degree of intelligence coverage are evident in the complex radio communication system developed under the noses of the Japanese during the days of their occupation. The entire archipelago, from north to south and from east to west, was literally dotted with guerrilla transmitting and receiving stations. Perhaps the best recapitulation of the rise of the guerrilla movement in the Philippines and its gradually growing part in the liberation of the Filipino people from the domination of the Japanese was given by General MacArthur shortly after his memorable return to Leyte, when he said, "As our forces of liberation roll forward, the splendid aid we are receiving from guerrilla units throughout the immediate objective area and adjacent islands causes me at this time to pay public tribute to those great patriots, both Filipino and American, who had led and supported the resistance movement in the Philippines since the dark days of 1942. These inadequately armed patriots have fought the enemy for more than 2 years. Most are Filipinos, but among these are a number of Americans who never surrendered, who escaped from prison camps, or who were sent in to carry out specific missions." Following the disaster which, in the face of overwhelming superior enemy power, overtook our gallant forces, a deep and impenetrable silence engulfed the Philippines. Through that silence, no news concerning the fate of the Filipino people reached the outside world until broken by a weak signal from a radio set on the island of Panay, which was picked up in the late fall of that same fateful year by listening posts of the War Department and flashed to my headquarters. That signal, weak and short as it was, lifted the curtain of silence and uncertainty and disclosed the start of a human drama with few parallels in military history. In it, I recognized the spontaneous movement of the Filipino people to resist the shackles with which the enemy sought to bind them both physically and spiritually. I saw a people in one of the most tragic hours of human history, bereft of all reason for hope and without material support, endeavouring, despite the stern realities confronting them, to hold aloft the flaming torch of liberty. I gave this movement all spiritual and material support that my limited resources would permit. Through the understanding assistance of our Navy, I was able to send in, by submarine, in driblets at first, arms, ammunition, and medical supplies. News of the first such shipment spread rapidly throughout the Philippines to electrify the people into full returning consciousness that Americans had neither abandoned them nor forgotten them. Since then, as resources increased, I was enabled, after formalizing the guerrilla forces by their recognition and incorporation as units of our army, to send vitally needed supplies in ever-increasing quantities through Philippine coastal contacts by 4 submarines finally committed exclusively to that purpose. I would that at this time I might name the gallant heroes of this epoch in Philippine-American history, but considerations of security for the individuals, their families, and the cause require that I limit myself to a generalization of their work and a statement of their brilliant achievements. Of the latter, I need but point out that for the purposes of this campaign, we are materially aided by strong, battle-tested forces in nearly every Philippine community, alerted to strike violent blows against the enemy's rear as our lines of battle move forward, and that now are providing countless large areas adjacent to military objectives into which our airmen may drop with assurance of immediate rescue and protection. We are aided by the militant loyalty of a whole people, a people who have rallied as one behind the standards of those stalwart patriots who, reduced to wretched material conditions yet sustained by an unconquerable spirit, have formed an invincible centre to a resolute overland resistance. We are aided by the fact that for many months our plans of campaign have benefited from the selflessly and defiantly subordinated all to the cause of human liberty. Their names and their deeds shall ever be enshrined in the hearts of our two peoples, in whose darkest hours they have waged relentless war against the forces of evil that sought, through ruthless brutality, the enslavement of the Filipino people. To those great patriots to whom I now pay public tribute, I say, stand to your battle stations and remain vigilant until our forces shall have stepped forward to relieve you. Operations to free the islands of the southern Philippines followed in swift succession upon the capture of Leyte and the successful invasion of Luzon. To assure complete domination of the shipping lanes of the southern and central Philippines and unquestioned control of the entire archipelago, General MacArthur ordered the immediate seizure of the strategically situated islands along the water route from San Bernardino Strait through the Sibuyan Sea to Verde Island Passage. The task of defeating the Japanese in the land areas of the Visayas and Mindanao was scheduled for the last stage of the Philippines campaign. During this final phase, when General MacArthur's right flank was secured, a limited operation for the recapture of Borneo was to be undertaken as the first step toward freeing the Netherlands East Indies. Plans for the operations in the southern Philippines and in the Netherlands East Indies had been completely changed after the Leyte operation was substituted for the previously scheduled invasion of Mindanao. With Leyte as the entering wedge into the Philippines, the advance into the Visayas and Mindanao had to be replanned. Montclair III was the name given to the new plan, dated the 25th of February 1945. Montclair III was divided into 2 separate but coordinated operations, Victor for the southern Philippines and Obo for the Netherlands Indies. The Victor operations were to be conducted entirely by United States troops of the 8th Army, while Australian forces were to assume responsibility for the seizure of Borneo, Java, and adjacent islands. Timing was dependent upon the progress of the fighting in Luzon, since the plan involved the commitment of available troops and means as soon as requirements of the Luzon operation had been met. The use of guerrillas in the central and southern Philippines was expected to permit rapid progress without necessitating great naval or aerial support. The operations for the central and southern Philippines were to be carried out in rapid succession. The landings on Palawan were to take place on the 28th of February 1945, at Zamboanga on the 10th of March, on Panay 5 days later, on Cebu 15 days later, and on central Mindanao on the 12th of April. Landings on Borneo under the Obo operations were scheduled for May and June. A preliminary to the Victor operations was initiated during the early part of February, as the 6th and 8th Armies jointly undertook to clear a sea route through the central Philippines. Although United States forces had by this time established bases on Leyte, Samar, Mindoro, and Luzon, the Japanese still controlled most of the southern islands. Their positions along the waterways of the central and southern Philippines could menace Visayan shipping from Leyte and the Philippine Sea. The shortest and most important route thus threatened by enemy forces was from San Bernardino Strait to Verde Island Passage around southern Luzon. Control of these waters by American forces would not only secure a vital shipping lane, but would also deny the Japanese an important channel for escape or reinforcement. The chain of islands stretching along this route for a distance of 325 miles was accordingly selected as the next operational target. On the 5th of February, General MacArthur directed the Eighth Army to institute operations at the earliest practicable date to clear the northern coast of Samar and the islands in the Cape Verde Passage, with the objective of securing the southern exits to San Bernardino Strait and Verde Island Passage. The Sixth Army was assigned the northern shores of this seaway, including all of Luzon and the small island of Maricaban at the mouth of Batangas Bay. 2 simultaneous landings were made on the 19th of February on the northwest corner of Samar and on a small island just offshore. This action initiated a series of amphibious operations conducted by troops under 8th Army Command to capture the islands, obstructing San Bernardino Strait, the Sibuyan Sea, and Verde Island Passage. The numerous landings were, in every instance, successful, many of them assisted in large part by guerrilla units, especially in the mop-up phases. The relief of the 108th Infantry on Masbate by Filipino troops on the 4th of May marked the completion of the 8th Army's mission in the waters of the northern Visayas. The sea route from the Lubang Islands in Verde Island Passage to the Balicuatro Islands in San Bernardino Strait was now cleared. Although scattered enemy remnants roamed the islands for some time thereafter, General MacArthur had control of the Visayan sea lanes and their principal entrances and exits. His supply route was secure. While amphibious landings were in progress on the enemy-held islands within the Visayan passages, attention was focused on the operations designed to destroy Japanese dominance in the Visayas and the southern Philippines. The 8th Army, early in February 1945, was assigned the task of liberating the islands bordering the Sulu Sea, Palawan region to the north and west, the Sulu Islands to the south, and Zamboanga Peninsula and Basilan Island to the east. The task of recapturing these areas was divided into 2 operations. The first, Victor III, called for the invasion of Puerto Princesa, Palawan, on the 28th of February. It would be followed shortly thereafter by Victor VI, the seizure of Zamboanga, Basilan Island, and the Sulu archipelago. Possession of these land areas would ensure control of 2 vital sea lanes, the north-south route between the Netherlands, East Indies, and Japan, and the east-west route from the central and southern Philippines to Singapore. Coordinated large-scale operations would then be conducted against the Japanese on Panay and Negros Occidental, with Cebu, Negros Oriental, and Bohol as the subsequent targets. The island of Palawan was of strategic importance because it dominated the passages between the southern Philippines and the South China Sea. It possessed several airstrips from which Allied planes could establish complete control of the 3 straits of Mindoro, Linapawan, and Balabac. The capture of Palawan would aid American forces in severing the Japanese supply lines between the East Indies and the Japanese homeland. Additionally, Palawan could serve as a supporting point for further Allied operations against Mindanao and the other islands in the southern Philippines. General Eichelberger designated the 41st Division under Major General Jens A. Doe for the tasks of liberating Palawan, Zamboanga, and the Sulu archipelago. The 186th Infantry Regimental Combat Team was assigned to the Palawan invasion, while the 162nd and 163rd Infantry were scheduled for the Zamboanga and Sulu operations. Responsibility for the amphibious phase of Victor III was given to Rear ADM, William M. Fechterle, commanding Naval Task Force 78.2, named the Palawan Attack Group. The 13th Air Force and the 1st Marine Aircraft Wing were designated as the Assault Air Forces, with additional support provided by Major General Ennis C. Whitehead's 5th Air Force. In preparation for the attack against Palawan, the 41st Division arrived at Mindoro from Biak on the 9th of February. Final plans were completed, and a separate task force headquarters was formed, with the 186th Regimental Combat Team, reinforced, as a nucleus. This task force, designated the Palawan Force, was activated on the 7th of February under the command of Briggs General Harold H. Haney. Palawan Force departed from Mindoro on the 26th of February and arrived off the southwest shore of Puerto Princesa early on the morning of the 28th. The landing beaches had already been under air bombardment for 48 hours, but an additional intensive concentration of naval gunfire and rocket barrage was laid down just before H hour. The assault troops encountered no enemy opposition, and a beachhead was quickly established at the Palawan landings, and their strategic significance were covered in the communiqué of the 2nd of March. We have landed on Palawan and seized control of this fifth largest and most westerly island of the Philippine archipelago. Engaged in operations elsewhere, the enemy again failed to diagnose our plan and properly prepare his defence. Elements of the 41st Division of the 8th Army, coordinated with naval and air support, landed near Puerto Princesa, the capital and major city of the island, and pushed swiftly inland to seize the town and 2 nearby airfields. The enemy fled to the hills, and our losses were very light. The airbase of Palawan commands the western end of the southern water passage through the Philippines by way of the Sulu Sea and interdicts the north and south channel of the South China Sea, the enemy's main water transportation line to Indochina, Thailand, Malaya, Singapore, Burma, and the East Indies. It places us within 500 miles of the enemy bases of Brunei Bay and Tarakan in North Borneo. It will therefore not only help to ensure the safe passage of our own sea transport, but render hazardous that of the enemy. The progressive securing of the Philippines as a base thus tends to cut the enemy in two and condemn all his conquests to the south to recapture. Operations ashore on Palawan were concentrated primarily on clearing the Puerto Princesa area. On all sides there was evidence of hasty Japanese withdrawal, and it was not until the 2nd of March that the retreating forces were contacted. From that time on, scattered Japanese units on Palawan were hunted down with the aid of organized guerrillas. On the 9th of March, reconnaissance troops went ashore on Dumaran Island, northeast of Palawan, and reported that the enemy had evacuated the island. By the 20th of March, the airstrips near Puerto Princesa, which had once been an important link in the Japanese ferry and transport route to the Netherlands East Indies, had been rebuilt into all-weather fields and put into operation. The liberation of Palawan was completed by the end of March. In mid-April, patrols of the 18th Infantry cleared Busuanga Island to the northeast of Palawan and Balabac and Pandanan Islands to the south. With this closing of the western exit to the Visayan Sea, the fate of the remaining enemy forces on Panay, Negros, Cebu, and Bohol was similarly sealed. The Japanese were cut off on all sides. As new naval bases were constructed on Palawan, motor torpedo boats of the 7th Fleet began to patrol the east and west coasts of the island, later extending their activities to adjacent areas, and finally reaching as far south as British North Borneo. Aircraft, meanwhile, carried out searches over the South China Sea and bombed Japanese installations from Borneo to Indochina. The ground troops, too, were expanding their scope of operations as the 41st Division turned its attention to the western tip of Mindanao, to Zamboanga and the Sulu archipelago. Basilan Strait, off the southwest tip of Mindanao, constitutes one of the 2 main approaches to the Asiatic mainland from the southwest Pacific. It is dominated by the city of Zamboanga and the peninsula of the same name. In American hands, Zamboanga would further constrict the enemy-held positions in the Philippines and virtually complete their encirclement. To the south of Basilan Strait lies the Sulu archipelago, a long chain of islands connecting Mindanao and Borneo. The islands lie directly astride the shortest water routes from the China Sea to the Celebes, the Moluccas, and New Guinea. Occupation of this area, coupled with control of Zamboanga, would completely isolate the Netherlands East Indies from the Philippines and provide valuable bases for future offensives against the Japanese in Borneo. Operation Victor W, the assault against Zamboanga and the Sulu archipelago, was consequently selected as the next operation for the 8th Army. Planning for the operation against Zamboanga and Sulu had been undertaken concurrently with the planning for the attack on Palawan, and their seizure was directed in the same field order. The 41st Division was designated as the assault force, with the 10th of March 1945 set as the date for the landing. These operations were to be followed by an assault on Mindanao proper, the principal strategic objective in the southern Philippine archipelago. Despite this planned sequence, the first invasion of Mindanao by American troops actually preceded the scheduled invasion of Zamboanga. In order to take advantage of certain guerrilla actions, an airborne landing was made between 8, the 10th of March on the north coast near Dipolog by 2 companies of the 24th Division. Their mission was to reinforce and secure the guerrilla-held Dipolog airfield to provide an airbase from which planes of the Far East Air Forces could operate in support of the Zamboanga invasion. Aided in their defense of the airfield by guerrilla forces, the American troops remained until nearly the end of March, permitting a squadron of fighters based on the airfield to share in the intensive preliminary aerial bombardment of Zamboanga. The garrison companies were evacuated by air on the 27th of March in the face of a strong advancing enemy force. Loading for the Zamboanga operation was completed at Mindoro on the 7th of March, while 6 LSTs were loaded with special equipment at Leyte. The Zamboanga attack group under rear ADM, Forrest B. Royal, departed from Mindoro Strait early the following day, encountering no hostile naval or air opposition. Rendezvousing with the elements from Leyte on the afternoon of the 9th for the passage through the Sulu Sea, the task force proceeded to Basilan Strait and stood off Zamboanga early on the morning of the 10th of March. Following an intense air and naval bombardment, reinforced units of the 41st Division, less the 186th Regimental Combat Team, which was still mopping up on Palawan, poured ashore against light opposition at San Mateo, just west of Zamboanga City. The 13th Air Force, which had been carrying out pre-invasion bombardment of the objective area since the 1st of March, continued the aerial pounding throughout the operation. General MacArthur was able to report on the 12th of March. "We have landed near Zamboanga on the southwesternmost tip of Mindanao. The bulk of the enemy garrison, caught off guard, has fled to the hills in disorder. We now control the entire length of the western shores of the Philippine Islands from the northwestern tip of Luzon to the southwestern tip of Mindanao, a distance of approximately 800 miles. The blockade of the South China Sea and the consequent cutting off of the Japanese conquests to the south is intensifying. Consolidation of the beachhead following the landing proceeded rapidly against sporadic enemy resistance.